This is Patrick Donley, and this is the building he's owned in the Germantown neighborhood of Louisville, Kentucky for the last 29 years. But it wasn't until 5 years ago, right as he was about to sell the property, that he discovered the secrets that were buried underneath of it over 100 years ago. You see, before his building and most of the other houses and buildings in the neighborhood were built, this part of Mary Street was considered to be on the outskirts of town when the city of Louisville was still heavily centered around downtown. And because of that, this part of Mary Street was used as a local trash dump from the late 1800s all the way through the Spanish flu pandemic in the early 1900s. During that time frame, this site was used by many of the homeowners and business owners in the general area to dump their trash that they were no longer using. Ceramic plates and cups, perfectly preserved bottles, silverware, toys, and even handguns. Patrick's finding a little bit of everything here, and he's in the process of turning his findings and the space itself into a museum to spin this former trash into a timeline, mapping out early life in Louisville, Kentucky between the late 1800s and early 1900s. Buckle your seatbelts. This is another episode of Creating Spaces. Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Creating Spaces. I'm your host, Sam Heine, sitting next to my friend Patrick Donley. He's a local artist and the owner of a building with one of the coolest stories that I think I've ever heard in a space around Louisville. And we're sitting in that space today. We're going to get the rundown. Patrick, thank you for joining us today. How are you doing?
You're welcome. Doing great.
Good. Let's start with just a 100-foot view of the story behind you purchasing the building. What exactly did you come to find here that happens to be underneath the building that you own?
Well, it goes back to 1995, and that's when we purchased the building to create art studios for ourselves. And for 30 years, that's how we operated, just making art and moving it out. And I was just about ready to sell the building 5 years ago when a groundhog started kicking material out from under the basement slab that wasn't just your typical construction trash or whatever that might be under the basement floor of a 1920s warehouse. And that's when I started digging, and 5 years later we've come to the conclusion that we are sitting on an urban midden that's one of the largest urban middens in downtown Louisville, on the fringe of downtown Louisville, and was used for approximately 40 years before it was shut down right after the pandemic of 1919.
Crazy. So a garbage dump.
It was a garbage dump.
And what's fascinating about that, so like late 1800s, early 1900s. And so at the time, this would have been outskirts of town. We're in Germantown right now, on Mary Street. And so at the time, a lot of Louisville was centered around downtown, West Louisville. Mm-hmm. And so people would come out here. I guess this would have been more of a country type of setting, and they just dump their trash, do you think? Or?
Well, there was, in 1865, we found records from the council passed an ordinance to fill in the pond on Mary Street. This was platted out as a neighborhood, as a potential neighborhood. And there was flooding because Beargrass Creek ran just down what is Swan right now behind us, and across the backyard of our building, and then on its course back to the river. And this is the low point of Mary Street. So this was a fall off lot, but it was a sinkhole. Mm-hmm. And so it ponded. And so that was the beginning of filling at this site. Uh-huh. So 1865 into the 1870s, but nothing was built on the first 4 lots until 1885, and that's the house that's on that end of our property. That's when that went up. So essentially, we expect to find trash in that property's backyard, and also in the corner property, because it wasn't there until 1902. Uh-huh. And then these buildings weren't built until the 20s, when they shut down using it as a dump.
Yeah.
So
it's fascinating. Before this interview, I looked up a map of Louisville, and I think it was 1880s, 1890s.
Yeah, there's an 1885 census map that went out.
That's what it was, yeah. And there's nothing over here. I mean, like maybe some of the further reaching strips a little bit closer to maybe what's now Shelby Park. Uh-huh. But there were no, like when you drive down Mary Street today, it's residential house next to residential house. It's a whole neighborhood, and there wasn't anything here. So I guess it would have been a perfect place for a dump, or a midden, as you called it.
Yeah, that's the fancy term.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And what's also interesting is that, you know, back in the day, if somebody stumbled across what would have been considered a dump, nobody would have thought anything of it. They're looking at things that people were throwing out. One man's trash, another man's treasure. Today, you stumble across it, it's amazing. You're finding, you know, old toys and dishes and bottles. And
right.
You're turning it into a museum now.
Well, and the unfortunate thing about it is, like, unlike some archaeological sites, this site was managed. So as a dump, the city would pay the landowners, to let their neighbors dump on the site. So there were rules. They had to have water on site in case of fire, and then they had to manage the site, which meant throw lime on rotting meat trash or whatever, anything was getting stinky, and occasionally cap it with fill dirt, but then also to move the stuff around, to level it. If it starts to pile up too much here, then get out there and with a shovel, whatever, toss things. So quite frequently, or I would say the majority of the things we come across are horribly smashed and just managed to death, if you want to say. But it's astounding that there is this much that is preserved. I mean, the number of bottles of every type are in. I'm approaching 5,000 bottles.
That's so wild.
In 5 years, and we still have a third of the basement to excavate.
Yeah.
As well as the backyard
and the properties.
The properties next door, if we can. We actually asked the neighbor on the right, and they said if we could do a test hole, just out in the backyard, just, you know, a small hole, and just go down and just see if we hit anything. We know we're going to, and they said sure, and we said, well, you know, we'll give you some money and let you keep some of the things that we find, but just to see and just to prove our point that we know it extends that far.
Yeah.
So
fascinating.
Yeah.
and you bought this. It's a building now in the mid '90s, and now, like kind of alluded to, there's neighborhoods, houses on either side. It's just your typical neighborhood. There's no garbage dump in sight. At the time, you didn't have any idea that there was a garbage dump? I mean, it wasn't 25, 30 years later until you discovered.
Right. When we bought the building, the floor in the basement had collapsed. We had no idea why, but with our research today, the 1937 flood, the Great Flood, got into the basement. We were the high water mark was right out here in Swan Street and Mary Street, the intersection, and it definitely got into our basement, and definitely in the basement of the bungalow next door and on the corner building. And when the waters receded, it was January, so it was cold, and there wasn't much power in the building, if any, at the time. And so when the waters receded, the floor, which was a floating slab, literally, came back down, and it had nothing to rest on because all the rotting trash underneath had been moved around by the floodwaters and had been decaying for, at that point, like 15 years. And so anyway, so the floor collapsed. We checked to make sure it wasn't a structural issue. We bought the building and just never fixed the floor. But we had to jackhammer out of sight an area to create a level spot where we could put water heaters. I mean, so we did a gravel pad. And in that process of jackhammering up the slab, we did find some old bottles, but we didn't think anything of it. It was like, oh, a beer bottle, that's construction trash. Construction workers, doing their thing, drinking a beer at the end of work and tossing it in the ground. So that just didn't, we were focused on one thing. We had to get this place up and ready so we could start making art again. And so it's like, we just didn't worry about it. So long story short, we did not think anything of it. So 30 years passed by. Phyllis shows me the truth.
Yeah, the groundhog. She knew it on some higher level, maybe that she knew that was serendipitous. I think.
I don't know. It was just so unusual that here suddenly there's a groundhog, and my thinking is I'm getting ready to sell the building. I need to trap her and relocate her.
Yeah.
And I tried 3 times to trap her, 3 times failed. She would get the food and kick the trap, and so, and it was right after that 3rd attempt that we found our first bottles, and I thought, what the hell is this? And started digging down and finding plates and doll parts and utensils and just I was like, this is domestic trash.
Yeah.
And then the light bulb went off, and I went to the other side of the room where there was a broken spot and pulled up the slab and dug there, and more of the same.
Yeah.
And so everywhere I went, I was getting more and more of that trash. So I started systematically breaking up the slab and working finishing an area and then moving forward, and finishing an area and moving forward.
There's so much left to be explored, and I think it's crazy that like the lots on either side are very likely the same thing. It's just riddled with all sorts of treasures.
Well, because the bungalow next door and this were both built by Herman Pohl, the moving and storage guy.
Mm-hmm.
He had been running the saloon on the corner with his family living upstairs, and he was running his moving and storage business out of there. They had a big barn-like garage on the back of the lot. And he bought the bungalow lot from the owners, but not these 2 lots early on, because he saw an opportunity. It's like, the city's paying money for this. I'll manage this part of the dump if you take care of those 2.
Yeah.
And then when the dumps were all shut down after the pandemic, the Spanish flu pandemic, we've had another pandemic since.
Yeah.
So then Pohl jumped on the opportunity to own the whole property and bought this. And he built the warehouse for his moving and storage, and he built the bungalow for his family. And that house has only had 2 owners.
Fascinating.
Since it was built in the 20s.
Yeah.
Because the family continued to live there generation after generation.
You gotta love that. Like the very close relatives like were alive at the time that this was a dump.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I guess maybe not exactly, but right after it was a dump.
Well, and I've made friends with the children of, they would be the great grandchildren of Herman Pohl, and they're my age now, but they grew up in that house.
Fascinating.
Which is, and I need to sit down with them and ask them if they would find things in the basement, or because their basement is got cracks and whatnot too.
Mm-hmm.
And there's actually, I think, a crawl space up front.
Oh yeah.
Which if I was a kid, I knew anything about it, I would have crawled in there and started digging.
Found some treasure. Yeah. Well, it's got to be a trip for you too, because you're an artist, and you kind of built out a niche in like found art. Like you would find recycled things that people maybe weren't using anymore, or just different odds and ends, and you lace it together into colorful art. To come across like the greatest found art collection of all time,
exactly, underneath
the building that you own.
Had the wrong person owned this building, they'd have filled that hole right back in.
Yeah.
Because all the flippers in the neighborhood that are buying houses and flipping them, they don't want to think about archaeology. Mm-hmm. They wanted this. I get letters every week from people wanting to buy this building because they're going to turn it into condos.
Mm-hmm.
And I just ignore it. I actually saved them all. I'm going to create a piece of art out of that.
Yeah.
At some point.
You should, yeah.
But it's the fact that I've been making art for 45 years with found objects. I've been picking up trash my whole life that I thought would have greater use.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me to be the one who inherited the dump, I think is just mind-blowing.
It's got to be meant to be. I mean, when you really, that's so crazy that like you were clearly passionate enough about that sort of thing to like consistently make art pieces out of it.
Mm-hmm.
And just randomly, you're about to sell this building and then you get the sign from a groundhog.
And I don't know why my instinct told me that it was a she. That's why I named her Phyllis. I thought I was being cute, but with Punxsutawney Phil and Phyllis. And it turns out she is female. She had 2 different sets of kits, of 3 kits each, 2 years, 1 year and then the next year. And they were the cutest things in the world. It was, the whole experience has just been so unique and inspiring. And when I make art again someday, something will come out of this, because right now I don't have time to make art.
Yeah. Well, you're creating something. So you're going to turn the site into a museum.
Yes. And because I am who I am, the museum will be 2/3 history, culture, and 1/3 art. So the displays will be magical, bright, lit, because you're dealing with a lot of glass. So you have the opportunity to create really interesting lighting and just to make the objects just become something special.
Yeah.
Instead of just a dusty old bottle museum.
Totally. Well, I mean, even this here, like you look at these.
And these pieces that I did, they're photography pieces, they'll be part of the museum. So that when you get to the castor oil section, which is what those bottles are, that piece will be hanging there right next to the display. However, it'll be incorporated into the display.
Yeah.
And I've got several works, and I may do more as we begin to flesh out the ideas about them. Because I love the idea of having visuals that aren't just the objects.
Yeah. And I guess, we say it was an old garbage dump, people throwing out things they weren't using anymore. And like, to me, like whenever I first heard that, I'm thinking like, okay, plastic trash bag, milk gallon, empty milk gallon, paper bag, but you're finding like toys and bottles and plates and utensils. I mean, like it's like real relic type things. What are a few of your favorite finds that are like the most fascinating to you? I know that's probably a tough question.
Well, it is a tough question because I think I find a new favorite thing almost every time we dig.
Yeah.
We definitely find something that we've never seen before every time we dig, which blows my mind, because how many Schlitz bottles do I have? But then that next day, I'll go down and dig an Indianapolis brewing company. But one of the most unusual things I found was a set of upper dentures, which you're digging through, dolls' heads and eyeballs and whatnot. And all of a sudden, here are these muddy, gross, caked teeth. And first of all, at that moment, because I also find bones. Yeah. A lot of, the butchers are over on Shelby Street. Well, I'm sure they would bring their trash over and dump it. And as well as then food trash from, domestic situations. And this was, my first instinct was, I found my first dead body,
Yeah.
Because pig bones are really similar to human bones.
Never know.
But the other cool thing that we find are pharmacy bottles. There were pharmacies, there were no Walgreens, there were no large chains. There were corner family-owned pharmacies, and if it wasn't a bar on a corner or a little grocery store, then it was a pharmacy, and it might have been a combo, bar and pharmacy, because a lot of the liquors back then were considered medicinal.
Yeah,
and a lot of the pharmacy products had a lot of alcohol in them, so there was a little bit of crossover.
Right.
But these pharmacies, they would. Their bottles, many of them were embossed with the name of the pharmacist, the address, and then Louisville, Kentucky. If it's Louisville, I find them from all over, but most of what we found that are labeled are Louisville, which has allowed us to go out and find if the building is extant, and so then we can. So in this section of the museum, we're going to explore that with here's the pharmacy, here's the bottle, here's the building today.
That's so cool.
And then here's the building, if we can find an old photograph of it, here's the building 120 years ago.
Yeah.
And so that's going to be really fun to piece together. Tell those stories. And the pharmacist has a story.
Yeah.
It's not just the story of pharmacy, it's the pharmacist. So we really want this museum to take the big picture, but then bring it down to the man or woman who created the product.
Right. It's crazy how many bottles you have intact too. Like you're putting
Mm-hmm.
a lot of pieces together that are in multiple pieces, and it's kind of like a puzzle piece. And you have a bottle. Well, it looks like maybe this.
It's
one,
got a crack.
Yeah, it's got a crack, but it's like, you know, you dug this out, and it's a full bottle. You can still see the label, the carving.
Mm-hmm.
So there must have been. This is a second to last question. There's got to be other dumps in Louisville. Do you know, like back in the day, where other locations would have been of something similar?
I don't know where, but there is a record. The women's, it's the Louisville City Women's Club in 1918 started to petition the city because there was no municipal pickup, and there were these dumps in areas throughout the downtown, probably more on the fringes.
Mm-hmm.
But they literally they created documents where they would list the addresses on a street and then locate the dump, identify the dump as a dump, like being used as a dump, and then take photographs. And they presented all of what their findings were
That is cool.
to the council and the mayor, and we're soliciting them to close these dumps down because the vermin and the flies were, quote, spreading the influenza. And they may have had a point, but we also know it was viral. So, but it was good enough work. They did a good enough job that they convinced the council and the mayor to shut the dumps down and build a new incinerator.
Mm-hmm.
They were supposed to build 3 per their requests, but they compromised on one big one, which is the Merriweather site, which is not too far from here. And so I don't know what how the timeline exactly is, but the incinerator, they started these, guys in white suits with mule carts going around on certain days to collect. You had to put your trash out on the curb in neat little containers,
Mm-hmm.
and they would fine you if you broke the rules about how to do that. And I bet there was a time period in the interim where neighbors would, you know how people are, they don't like change, and
Yeah.
they'd still come down and probably toss stuff into the dump here. But Herman Pohl, like I said, saw an opportunity. He bought up the land and stopped using it as a dump and built his buildings.
Yeah.
And that's the end of the dump. So I know there's nothing underneath this building that is newer than 1922,
Yeah.
which is kind of cool.
That is cool. How cool would it be to get your hands on the photos that they took to present?
Well, Lisa Pisterman, who works with me and has been an invaluable research tool. She's great. She loves history and loves Germantown and has access to the archives. And so she's been looking. She knows about this, that she read in someone's dissertation about this process, has seen facsimiles, but where those original documents are is a mystery.
Wow.
And so we're hoping, this is like, if we could find
That'd be cool.
a picture of Mary Street from then,
Oh man.
that would make my day. And that would be this, when you first come into the museum, when the museum is ready, you'll enter into the history room, which will tell the story, the backstory of the building, of Herman Pohl coming from Germany in 1907, and then just build up the history of me and Phyllis, my discovery of the dump.
Yeah.
And any other things that we can fit in that prepare you for what you discover when you walk into the light-filled display area in the back that just sort of opens up into
Setting
this
the tone.
amazing. But you get the backstory, so then you get the rest of the history.
Uh-huh. Oh man.
So it's going to be a really cool place.
Yeah. Where do you hope this project to be in 5 years? You want?
In 5 years, I hope we're open. We're open to the public. I'm hoping to attain the building next door, the bungalow, because it is part of the story. It's where the family lived, and I would use that for offices and the gift shop, and then that way this whole building, 4,000 square feet, can be museum. We're gonna, the basement, when the basement's done excavating, we are going to condition the space, repair any damage that the flood caused to the foundation or the groundhog caused to the foundation, backfill it, pour a new floor, add really good lighting, condition the space, and move the collection back to where it came from.
Yeah.
So line the walls with shelving, put tables down there for research, and we'll make the collection available to the public, you know, through application to come and look through or whatever, or research something if they, because of course, with 5,000 bottles, they're not all going to be in the museum.
Yeah.
So a lot of it will be stored downstairs. We will monetize some of it. The gift shop is going to be a great opportunity for us to take a little bottle like this and put a cool logo on it, our logo, and you know, own a piece of the mid.
Yes.
That's how you support us, is by buying a piece of the mid.
Totally. Yeah.
So we'll make jewelry from pottery shards, and
I mean, you could probably make some epic artwork, sort of like what you had been making, right? I mean, just with found stuff like this. I always thought that would be fascinating, like found.
Well, by incorporating that, but by incorporating these photographs, this series of photos in the museum, then to sell small scale versions of them.
Yeah.
Print, you know, like print that as an 8x10, or 8x8 square, and sell that, and then, you know, so we'll have that as a, you know, there're going to be a lot of, you know, we'll have books, and we'll have plush groundhogs for the kids.
Yeah.
You know.
That's so cool. What a cool thing. I can't wait to see it when it's done.
Me either.
Yeah. Well, stay tuned, everybody. I mean, I think it's going to be the coolest museum in town. It by far the most unique.
Yes.
So I'm looking forward to seeing what the finished product looks like.
There's nothing like it.
Yeah. Yeah. How can the folks at home stay up to date with updates?
We are groundhogarchaeology.com, and I also am at Donley Art, at DONLEY Art on Instagram, and I'm also on Facebook. There's the Mary Street Midden Project is what the museum's going to be called, and there's a Facebook page for that as well. So any of those sites, I try to keep posting as often as possible.
Awesome. Well, cool. Well, we'll stay tuned, everybody. Hope you enjoyed. This is going to be one to stay tuned for. Patrick, I appreciate you coming on, man.
Amen.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody. Talk to you soon.
Cheers.